On a sweltering afternoon in January 1968, the skies over Khe Sanh were about to become a stage for devastating destruction. The F-4 Phantom, an icon of American military aviation, sliced through the clouds, its deafening roar echoing off the surrounding mountains. The aircraft's immense shadow fell across the dense jungle, which would, in an instant, become a fiery inferno. The pilot peered through his cockpit canopy, focusing on the combat zone. "This is our moment," he thought, as he triggered the bomb release mechanisms. The mission was clear: drop explosive payloads on fortified enemy positions. With the flick of a switch, the napalm began to fall, first in ribbons, then in torrents. On the ground, the Viet Cong resistance braced for impact. A soldier, hidden beneath the thick foliage, watched with a mix of confidence and apprehension. Victory is ours, he thought, certain that the courage of his countrymen and their familiarity with the terrain would overcome American firepower. Fearful, little did he know that the blanket of fire descending from the sky would change the very meaning of fighting for one's homeland. When the napalm hit the ground, the result was explosive. Intense yellow flames licked at the forest as black smoke billowed upwards, obscuring the fading sunlight. The heat was unbearable, and the thunderous sound of the explosions reverberated through the mountains, shattering the silence of the otherwise tranquil jungle. Within the minds of the Viet Cong fighters, a new wave of doubt began to creep in. Can we withstand this? The question arose, and with it, the tension mounted. Khe Sanh, an American outpost in hostile territory, had become a battlefield where American air superiority clashed with Viet Cong resilience. The terrain was treacherous: jungle-covered mountains, narrow valleys, and the constant oppressive humidity made the fight even more complicated. The forecast called for torrential, seasonal rains, but that wouldn't stop the American war machine. U.S. forces had promised a new combat doctrine, one where air power and artillery would take center stage. The song of war played in their minds, an anthem common to soldiers on every side of the battlefield. It was a fight of courage against an adversary unwilling to accept defeat. The Viet Cong trusted their adaptability, the guerrilla tactics they had perfected over years. But what did that trust mean in the face of a technological storm? In the words of an old commander, serious, "When the rain turns to fire, the face of war changes." The phrase echoed like a mantra through every unit. But this weapon, napalm, would put their adaptability to the desperate ultimate test. The F-4 Phantom wasn't just any aircraft. It was a symbol of American air power. With superior speed, incredible maneuverability, and the ability to carry a vast arsenal of weapons, including napalm, its presence on the front line meant the war was changing. On every mission, the flying machine left its mark not only on the land, but also on the morale of the Viet Cong troops. With each flyover, the knot in their stomachs tightened, creating a psychological terrain where resistance grew ever more fragile. The Viet Cong, until then confident in their resilience, began to question their chances against the approaching calamity. One bombing run after another, each F-4 explosion was a note in the symphony of war. Every exchange of fuel and munitions was a chess piece on a board where the fate of many hung in the balance. What else could they expect for the future? How could the other soldiers fight a force that seemed so overwhelming? As the napalm lit up the sky in flames, a question hung in the air. How could they have misjudged the force that was coming? What was the true price of resilience when faced with the enemy's awesome technology of war?
The confrontation at Khe Sanh was just beginning, and the unfolding events promised to transform life as they knew it into a landscape of desperation and struggle. Want to find out how the F-4 changed the war? Dive into this analysis. The sky over Khe Sanh had transformed into a vast battlefield, and the F-4 Phantom, with its majestic presence, had become the true protagonist. But to understand the impact of its presence, it's crucial to examine what made it a technological marvel. The F-4 Phantom was more than just a plane. It represented an era of military innovation, where the power of turbojet engines and the concept of air superiority demanded a new kind of strategic vision. With a speed exceeding 1,470 miles per hour, the F-4 not only outpaced previous-era aircraft, but redefined what was possible in aerial combat.
Its powerful J-79 engines left a trail of smoke and a sound so commanding that it was enough to intimidate the enemy on its own. While it couldn't match the dogfighting agility of older WW-2 fighters, the Phantom had an impressive payload capacity, able to carry over 8,000 pounds of weaponry, from conventional bombs to guided missiles. This meant the F-4 could carry a full load of napalm, the fearful of the jungle. In its attack configuration, the F-4 could carry up to 1,300 gallons of napalm, enough to turn a battlefield into an inferno. The F-4's development was no accident. It emerged from necessity in the context of the escalating conflict in Vietnam. Its introduction was a response to strategic challenges and the need for a multi-role fighter. What began as a project for a tactical fighter evolved into a close air support bomber capable of performing multiple missions in a single sortie. The evolving military strategy required the U.S. to have a machine that could conduct large-scale airstrikes while simultaneously supporting ground troops. In the 60s, the reality of the battlefield was changing rapidly, and the F-4 was the answer to this new approach. But how did this compare to the tactics of the Viet Cong? The Viet Cong, with their guerrilla tactics, were a force to be reckoned with. Though outmatched in conventional combat, they adapted, using well-known supply routes and ambushes to surprise American troops. They relied on a limited arsenal, largely composed of AK-47 rifles, machine guns, and anti-aircraft weapons. Their strength was in their numbers and their familiarity with the terrain. A Viet Cong soldier could blend into the landscape and operate silently, waiting for the right moment to strike. But how could these guerrilla tactics stand against a plane that rained fire from the sky? For an antagonist outmatched by technological evolution, the answer would not be easy. Although the Viet Cong were known for their determination and courage, their struggle was challenged by the rain of napalm. As the F-4 bombed enemy positions, the effectiveness of napalm in altering the outcome of battles was undeniable. The intense heat and relentless flames created a sense of despair in the enemy ranks. However, the scene was more complicated than one might initially imagine. The impact of the F-4 and napalm sent a shockwave through Viet Cong morale. But it also revealed the vulnerability of American soldiers. Pilots and ground troops began to question whether technology alone would be enough to secure a long-term victory. But will this be enough to turn the tide of the war? This question blossomed in the minds of many. The reliance on a technological tool could quickly become a trap, especially when facing unexpected challenges in combat. As the fight for Khe Sanh progressed, the relationship of trust between the F-4 and the troops on the ground became increasingly complex.
With the development of new weapons like the M61 Vulcan cannon and the introduction of air-to-air missiles, missions were no longer just about bombing. The compatibility between weapons strategy and the phases of combat became a central issue. The F-4 itself was a portrait of modern warfare, but it also revealed the difficulties of integrating and adapting men and machines. The F-4's specifications, combined with its versatility, made clear the U.S. intention to continue the fight in a war that seemed endless. What remained to be seen was who would be better prepared to withstand the pressure of the circumstances. The clash between technology and tactics would make Khe Sanh a testing ground for a war that demanded more than just strength. It demanded adaptability and resilience from forces on all sides. Now that you understand the machine, see it in action. Turn on notifications. On the gray morning of February 3, 1968, Khe Sanh became the stage for a new phase in American military operations. The cockpit of the F-4 Phantom was a flurry of instruments, lights blinking incessantly as the pilot checked the aircraft's altitude and speed. He made one last adjustment before beginning his descent toward the front line. This would be his first napalm bombing mission over Khe Sanh, and adrenaline pulsed through his veins. The operation was carefully planned, tasked with altering the course of the battle against Viet Cong forces in a complex and treacherous terrain. Just below, the enemy positions seemed stable, but the confidence emanating from the Viet Cong was misleading. They believed their familiarity with the jungle and their cunning tactics would be enough to withstand another attack. Little did they know that napalm was about to turn their concept of safety into a burning nightmare. With the press of a button and the sound of ordnance release,
the napalm canisters began their descent, arcing toward the ground, creating a scene both grotesque and mesmerizing. Upon impact, the napalm exploded into incandescent flames, consuming the vegetation and everything in its path with overwhelming force. Cries of surprise and panic spread through the Viet Cong ranks. The heat was so intense that a feeling of despair hung in the air, more palpable than the smoke that filled the space. Those who were prepared to fight found themselves in a battle against the approaching flames and devastation. The effects of the napalm strike became immediately apparent. In a matter of seconds, entire swaths of forest were reduced to ash, and fortified enemy positions disintegrated before the advancing fire. The combination of the initial explosion with the subsequent ignition of the devastating chemical mixture was a fearful, terrifying spectacle that left deep scars on the landscape and on the spirits of the combatants. There is something visceral about the sound of an airstrike, the pressure wave, the deafening echo of the explosion, and the sense that, at the center of the action, history is being forged. As the Viet Cong regrouped, a young soldier on the front line watched in horror as the inferno unfolded. Fear mixed with courage, the fight was no longer just for victory, but for survival itself. How can we endure this, he thought, looking at his comrades struggling to put out the flames and stay alive. And so the battle intensified. The F-4, now a specter in the sky, continued its destructive work, making high-speed passes, diving and climbing, all while adapting its maneuvers to the needs of the troops on the ground. In the cockpit, the pilot felt a mix of euphoria and determination, working in perfect sync with his co-pilot. The fire came, and with it the fear, he reflected, as communications with the ground team became vital in coordinating the attack. But the results were not entirely what everyone expected.
Although the power of napalm proved effective in devastating positions, surprises were in store. The guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong could not be underestimated. In response to the growing presence of the F-4, the Vietnamese dispersed through the forests and ambushes, showing that their adaptability remained a powerful force. They learned to conceal their movements and to take advantage of the moments when the fire ceased. The F-4, in its first trial by fire, became a symbol of power, but it also carried the uncertainties that chipped away at its aura of invincibility. The emotional and physical impacts of the battle began to accumulate in the soldiers' hearts. By the end of the first day of napalm bombing, casualties were high and new challenges were already appearing on the horizon. But the battle was just beginning. What else were the American forces preparing? The universal question echoed among the soldiers. Between the memories of victims and survivors, the human cost of war became increasingly evident. In the eternal fight for victory, the price to be paid became a shadow that accompanied every move on the battlefield's horizon. The rules of war were changing, and adaptability was becoming the greatest skill for both the Americans and the Viet Cong. Felt the impact of napalm? New operations are on the way. Hit that like button. On February 10, 1968, the battlefield at Khe Sanh was thick with palpable tension. The heat and humidity of the jungle created a suffocating environment that intensified every sensation. After days of incessant bombing, the expectation was for an offensive directly linked to the attacks of the F-4 Phantom, which had now become a legend among the soldiers. American troops, both on the ground and in the skies, prepared for a clash that promised to be decisive. The day's mission focused on Operation Niagara, a direct response to the Viet Cong guerrilla tactics that had proven effective in evading the napalm. The American strategy was being refined. Now, instead of merely carpet bombing, the focus would be on more dynamic interactions with the troops on the ground. The military was implementing a new approach known as sustained air support, which consisted of more targeted and coordinated airstrikes with the movement of ground troops. The F-4s were linked to radar, each of their movements monitored with precision. The radio crackled with instructions from the battlefield, where the infantry unit was advancing slowly under air cover. What many didn't realize was that for every one of their airstrikes, there was an increase in defenses. The enemy was adapting. The Viet Cong troops had begun to build underground bunkers and use tunnels,
creating a subterranean network so extensive that it stretched for miles. In the mind of the American commander, this created a dilemma. How do you bomb an enemy you can no longer see? As part of the plan, alerted by the need for a more careful approach, American units joined forces to conduct a series of armored operations. M48 Patton tanks and M113 APCs took positions along critical points, forming a front line that would serve as a bastion against possible counterattacks. The air was charged with expectation and anxiety. The soldiers looked to the sky, waiting for the F-4s that promised not only devastation but also protection. When the planes finally appeared overhead, the scene was singular. The turbines roared, and with meticulous precision, the F-4s began their swooping runs. As the bombs were released, the echoes of the explosions reverberated through the jungle, creating a sound that resonated in every part of the battlefield. But the explosions were not just a symphony of death. They also presented opportunities. This was the moment when American soldiers advanced, trying not only to occupy territory, but also to gain crucial intelligence on the enemy. However, the Viet Cong response was quickly evident.
For every napalm explosion that lit up the sky, the guerrillas found ways to maneuver, to ambush, to turn every attack into an opportunity for resistance. The command on the ground realized that an intricate counteroffensive was unfolding. What began as a promising advance quickly turned into a war of attrition, where the Viet Cong, in small groups, would attack the units and retreat back into the jungle. It was during that afternoon that a group of American soldiers under direct attack found themselves pinned down in an ambush. The command shouted over the radio, calling for urgent air support. The F-4, even in its art of destruction, was not a magic solution. There was a moment of hesitation as the pilot and co-pilot weighed the implications of attacking so close to their own line of soldiers. The order was given, and the engines roared again, descending for a decisive strike. Bombs fell in a shower of fire, only to find an empty space, as the enemy had already moved. The silence after the explosion was heavier than any bullet. The battle raged on. The immediate result of the operation left an ambiguous feeling,
as confidence mixed with a growing skepticism. Challenges that once seemed distant were now a palpable reality, and the definition of victory and defeat became blurred in a war of this intensity. What was initially expected to be a day of conquest had turned into a test of endurance. The fight in Khe Sanh became a symbol of what the war could become, a battle between the most advanced technology and human determination. On the horizon, new challenges and goals were forming, and the question hung in the air. Would the combination of airstrikes and ground units be enough to guarantee victory in a constantly changing environment? Are you ready to find out what happens next? Subscribe and ring that bell. At dawn on February 25, 1968, Khe Sanh pulsed with the mounting tension of a new day of battle. The air was oppressive, as if nature itself was holding its breath, awaiting the unfolding of events that could change the course of the war. For the American and Viet Cong soldiers, the battle promised to be not just another conflict, but a dramatic climax where the technological superiority of the United States and the guerrilla cunning of North Vietnam would face off in a decisive confrontation. The American commander, now aware of the need for a coordinated attack, decided to launch Operation Mosaic, a codename for the offensive aimed at conquering a strategic point on the front line. Arming the F-4 Phantom in a new bombing configuration, the operation united the force of ground artillery, armored units, and air cover in a symphony of combat that aimed not only to repel the enemy, but also to, hopeful, restore confidence in the troops on the ground. The first wave of attacks began with the F-4s roaring into action, tearing through the sky with their swift, acrobatic maneuvers. The J-79 engines vibrated, and extended reconnaissance on each mission became the new norm. The objective was clear: bomb the Viet Cong command centers and eliminate the stealth tactics the enemy had implemented. At this point, expectations were high, and the soldiers prepared for a confrontation that promised to be the decisive clash. The silhouettes of the F-4s newly risen into the sky were soon followed by the deafening roar of explosions resonating in the surrounding forests. Napalm made its return. The fearful flames soon shattered any illusion of security the enemy might have had. The remarkable images of trees whispering in the wind transformed into dancing shadows under the fire from the sky as the Viet Cong braced for the devastating impact. The tension was at its peak. The airstrike was far from an absolute success. For every explosion that lit up the morning darkness, the Viet Cong forces not only resisted but adapted. Their tactics had to change. The enemy's resistance intensified. In previously secure locations, the guerrillas, in response to the bombings, began using their own communication systems, bypassing the American operational plans. They had become more than an opponent. They were an almost chameleonic force, blending in and dispersing, making the precision of the airstrikes difficult. As the F-4s continued to attack, the weather itself became an adversary. Climatic conditions rapidly deteriorated, with heavy rains creating a blanket of mud that hindered troop movement and communication. For the American soldiers, the reality became a struggle not only against the Viet Cong forces, but also against the limitations imposed by the terrain itself. The fighting deteriorated into a series of ambushes where American soldiers were often caught by surprise. The lines separating friend from foe blurred in an instant. At one point, a small platoon was surrounded by the Viet Cong resistance, and a call for help was desperately transmitted over the radio. In the sky, the F-4s, still conducting bombing runs, heard the desperate, agonizing plea. The moment became critical. The pilots, at the end of a run, made the decision to descend for a risky attack. The sound of the jet diving made everyone's nervous heart race. The tension created a lump in their throats, but there was no time for hesitation. It was a matter of life or death. Bombs were released, the F-4 expelling napalm once more, generating an explosion comparable only to the heat of hell. But the scene unfolded in a cycle where destruction brought only brief relief. For the soldiers on the ground, Sod Top's hopes of a breakthrough began to seem illusory. In this context, what had begun as a day of promise turned into a clash between modern warfare and the cornered tenacity of the guerrilla warriors. The incessant rain of napalm, visibly powerful, did not guarantee victory. And so, under the heavy sky, the battle became a dance between destruction and resilience.
The true cost of war emerged like a shadow, with each soldier aware that his next step could be his last. What they didn't know was that the fight not only shaped their lives, but left indelible marks on military history as a whole. Risk and reward seemed increasingly intertwined, and the question that had lingered for so long finally began to emerge with more clarity. What would it mean to win amidst so much suffering? Continue following the transformation of war. Don't miss the next episode. As the sun set on Khe Sanh, the reddish light reflected off the devastated terrain, creating a grim contrast between the beauty of the twilight and the devastation caused by the war. The superficial calm was deceptive. The American soldiers, though temporarily relieved, were aware that the battle was not over. Whispers of enemy strategy and tactics carried on the wind, and a new kind of nervous tension hung in the air. What had been a war of technology and brute force was rapidly becoming a psychological battle. In the rear, a group of Viet Cong leaders gathered to discuss ongoing operations. The past few weeks had proven decisive, and among them, a Viet Cong commander named Nguyen had distinguished himself with his ability to predict American movements. With sharp insight and an almost mystical ability to adapt his tactics, he had quickly become a respected name among the insurgent forces. Nguyen knew the enemy was underestimating the guerrillas' capabilities. The Americans think technology and firepower guarantee them victory, he told his team, his voice firm. But they don't know the determination of the Vietnamese people. We must strike where they least expect it, even when they are prepared. His words were a call to action, a summons to the spirit of resistance that characterized the fighters of Vietnam. Through a series of small ambushes and guerrilla tactics, Nguyen mounted a counterattack that would last for days. The strategy involved not only attacking, but also frequently using the underground tunnels that provided safety and mobility, an aspect the American forces had not yet managed to neutralize. As a result, the Viet Cong gained a tactical advantage, making the American soldiers question their own nervous security and effectiveness in the hostile terrain. During these activities,
The American command began to realize that their capabilities were tied not only to advanced weaponry, but also to their understanding of the terrain and the nature of their adversary. For every successful airstrike, there was an almost always planned tactical response from the enemy, revealing a cycle of serious, continuous adaptation unfolding before their eyes. One night operation became critical. An American platoon deep in the jungle received orders to advance in this new phase of the fight. Under a starlit but tense sky, they heard thunder in the distance, the sound of the stealthy passage of Viet Cong guerrillas. They were ready to infiltrate, but that night saw them surrounded by an invisible siege. The roar of surprise explosions and bullets crossing the air dominated the scene, and a palpable sense of fearful dread took hold of the American ranks. When a request for reinforcement was issued and the F-4s were scrambled for air support, the pilots were aware that this wasn't just about explosions, but about the very survival of their comrades on the ground. As the planes fired, the tension was felt more acutely. They flew over the jungle, searching for a chance to clear the path. But something wasn't right. As the jets approached the front line, what happened was a surprised shock. The realization that their bombs could be falling on their own troops resulted in a chaotic situation. The radio filled with desperate, anxious voices. "Watch your fire! They're on top of us!" But amidst the panic and confusion, the deafening noise drowned out any clear communication. Nguyen, on the other hand, watched from the field as the American troops became vulnerable. The fight between the two sides began to take on much deeper nuances. The F-4 attack brought a moment of relief, but it also caused a confusion the Viet Cong units had long studied. It was a brutal example of how technology, however overwhelming, could fail when communication broke down. The consequences of this friendly fire incident became immediately apparent. The mood among the American troops shifted, and loyalty began to fray, creating a sad despondency that reverberated through the ranks. The cost of war was reflected not just in the number of dead, but in the sad mistrust that was beginning to seep into the very heart of its fighters. In this scenario, the continuation of the fight and one side's ability to adapt to the other's failures would define the future of the conflict. As Nguyen prepared for his next move, the American allies were mired in sad grief and uncertainty. How would this new dynamic reveal itself? Would the adaptability of a strong people be enough to win in an environment where every mistake was costly? These questions hung in everyone's mind as the war deepened its endless cycle of evolution and resistance. What new twists await in the battle? Be sure to follow along. As night fell over Khe Sanh, a heavier darkness, studded with uncertainty, took hold of the battlefield. The flames of past explosions still briefly illuminated the landscape, but the atmosphere was permeated by a sense of desperation and profound skepticism among the American troops.
The echo of the friendly fire incident still resonated in the soldiers' minds, and the fight for trust, both in their commanders and in the effectiveness of military technology, had become as challenging as the fight against the enemy. In a makeshift shelter, a group of soldiers gathered, trying to piece together their resolve as they analyzed the difficult path ahead. "We're fighting ourselves and our mistakes more than we're fighting them," said one, a sergeant with a weary gaze, as he examined a worn map. It was a statement that, in recent days, had become a painful reality with every move on the field. Technological victories felt hollow when accompanied by such human fragility. Nguyen, on the opposing side, was aware of the psychological impact of the war itself. Serious, the real goal is not to conquer territory quickly, but to wear down the enemy's will, he taught his soldiers. For him, there was value in resistance, a strength in patience. Adaptability had become a mantra among his troops, and every small success fueled a confident spirit. His time in that region was not just a fight for independence, but an indication of a cultural and national transformation. With this philosophy in mind, Nguyen devised a confident plan. He envisioned a night attack when the American troops would be most tired, more prone to hesitation and doubt. The cover of night would allow his men to move with discretion, and the intensity of the attack, combined with the confusion already settling in the enemy's minds, could create an opening. That night, as the moon hung low, Nguyen and his troops advanced toward the American camp. The shadows moved like ghosts, and the silence of the night was broken only by quiet whispers and the cautious steps in a jungle already familiar with war. In the American camp, the soldiers tried to find the fuel and determination to resist. The heavy images of fallen comrades were still fresh in their memories, and doubt intensified as the horizon became uncertain. When the Viet Cong finally attacked, it was as if the moon itself had been blotted out by a lightning strike. The American sentinels, grabbing their weapons in an alert posture, were caught by surprise. The attack was fast, violent, and most importantly, well coordinated. Explosions and gunfire echoed through the jungle, and the idea that the American troops were in control quickly crumbled, like sand through their fingers. The F-4 jets, which had been an essential part of the military assault, now struggled to support the tangled terrain. The flawed communication between air and ground units was even more compromised. The voices, once full of bravery and firmness, became echoes of desperate confusion and despair. At the mercy of the night, the soldiers thought, victory was no longer a matter of firepower, but of determination and resilience. Amid the cries of battle and the roar of chaos, both Americans and Viet Cong found themselves facing their raw humanity. What had begun as a confrontation of technology had transformed into a test of each man's willpower. The response to the enemy attack became a fight not only for survival, but also for the value of their existence in the war. What was war, after all? Was it destruction, death, sacrifice? Or was it the ability to resist, to persist, and to keep fighting? By the end of that night, Khe Sanh became a crucible for restructuring not only tactics, but also concepts of what it meant to fight. The troops regrouped, and the lines dissolved precisely where adaptability revealed itself, highlighting a fundamental character of both sides: unshakable resistance. And in that darkness, the question everyone was asking became more than a doubt. It transformed into a timeless account of what war truly demanded. Khe Sanh thus became a symbol of what was to come. The developments of this struggle would mark a legacy that would span decades.
With each step after that night, the Vietnam War would become a study not only of weaponry, but of humanity in the midst of adversity. And as the lingering impact of the battle spread over the years, what would be remembered in the future? What would be the true legacy of this great struggle, not just in terms of conquest, but of lessons learned about war and resistance? These memories would not just be narratives of victories and defeats, but of the hopeful, indomitable human spirit capable of withstanding the flames of war. In the silence that followed, these questions would continue to echo through history.